Hey, Bobby here with Coder Foundry. Let's talk about Blazor render modes. Here at Coder Foundry, we're getting ready to switch over to Blazor in 2024. And one of the main questions that came up in our research when trying to use the preview is, what are render modes? How do they work? When should I use them? And so we built an application called Blazor Movie to explore all the render modes using the same page layout to see how the different modes work. How do you code them? How do they behave to the end user so that you can make good decisions when you're building your apps out? So today we're going to talk specifically about just one of these modes, which is SSR, or server-side render. Now, there's two modes that go hand in hand together with this. This is SSR and then streaming, okay? And we're going to show you how both of those work. But in general, SSR mode will bring back an entire HTML page on a response. So it basically, you make a page request, the request goes out to the server, and then it comes back with the full page. And if I refresh that, you can see that's what happens here. You can see the spinning is loading, and then the page comes back, okay? And so interactivity for a server-side render mode is going to be done with JavaScript. Now, I know you're probably thinking, hey, I thought Blazor removed the need for JavaScript. Well, Microsoft has introduced multiple render modes, and some of those require JavaScript. Server-side is a lot like MVC and Razor Pages, and it's just a basic server-side render mode that brings back an entire page. If you want this button to click, you got to use JavaScript to do that. Now, you're probably asking yourself, well, why would I use this instead of MVC? I already know how to use MVC. Well, the component story is so compelling here that allows us to build our page with components, and it makes it easier and faster to develop. Also, because of the way the code is organized, it's easy to just turn on some of these features down the line, whether you want to use SignalR or WebAssembly or even the auto mode, without changing the code. So there's a lot of reasons why we want to adopt server-side rendering in our applications, all right? So when we have the need for a static page, hey, we can render this, all right? So let's look at the code to see how this works, all right? So I'm going to go into Visual Studio. Now, of note, when I'm recording this, this is in the preview version of Visual Studio. I think it's preview 7, and I also had to separately download the SDK for .NET 8. So in order to get this running, you're going to have to download the preview for Visual Studio and a separate download for the SDK for .NET 8, all right, until this is in a release version, okay? So you can go to the GitHub and go to our GitHub. The link is below, and you can clone this repo and bring it down or get you a copy of it. But let's focus in on how this code is organized. So the first thing I want you to understand is there's a client project and a server project. The only thing we're concerned about with today is the server project. The client project is obviously for when we cover WebAssembly. But today we're talking about SSR, server-side rendered, so we only care about the server project. And in here, there is a pages folder, and these are our pages. They're really components, but they're pages. And a pages is a component with a route. And so let's look at the movie list SSR component and just look how it's laid out real quickly. And then how do we achieve this with a render mode? Now at the top here, you can see we have a using statement that allows us to bring in some models to our page, some types that we put together. And this is how routing works in Blazor. We just have a page directive here and we just give it a route. Pretty simple, pretty basic, but pretty powerful. You can call this page whatever you want. So the route to this is /movies/SSR. And if you type that into the browser, it'll respond to that and come to this page, okay? We've also injected an instance of an HTTP client. If you're not familiar with C# and you're coming from other things like JavaScript, HTTP client is the C# way for us to call web APIs or endpoints. So it's a lot like a fetch that you've seen if you've used that in JavaScript. So HTTP client is our way to do send and receive HTTP messages, okay? All right, so that's kind of how it works. Now, notice here we also can run C# inside of this. It's called a Razor page or a Razor component, and we can check to see if the movie response is null. And you may be thinking, like, what does that mean? Okay, Well, look down here in our code behind here, and you can see I have this await here that just delays the page purposely for 3 seconds so we can see what's going on here. And you can see here I have an HTTP request that goes out to a URL here, movie/popular. Now, hey, if you've called HTTP requests before, either from fetch or some other way, or even from HTTP client, you're like, hey, that's not a complete URL. How does that work? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's go over that real quick. Inside of Program CS, we have set up a couple of minimal APIs here that allow us to call the endpoint to the movie database, all right, API. And that's injected from a service here. So we have a little quick service that we put together here, right here, that sets the base address. You can see here api.movie.api.org-3. This is the base URL for this client. And then we also can pass in our bearer token. Right here on line 14, you're going to have to put your bearer token either here as a string or configure your user secrets inside of Visual Studio. If you're new to Visual Studio and you don't know how to set up user secrets, that's fine. You can just put your string right here and it'll work. It's a good practice to use user secrets because it also, if you want to publish this and get it out, you're going to have to put this in an environment variable, and this supports environment variables and user secrets. All right. But either way, you need to get your own key here for this to work. And then we have in here, we can just simply call this on this endpoint. It'll listen on this endpoint here, and it'll return to us a strongly typed response from the movie API. Okay, and this is called popular movie response, and this is a class that we've put together. Okay, and basically the class allows us to take JSON and map that to C# properties. So let's look at our models here, and you'll see that in here we have popular movie response. You can see I've got a page, and then I've got a list of popular movie, and inside of the popular movie I've got whether this is an adult movie or not, backdrop, genre IDs. You can look at their documentation of their API if you need more information about this. But this will take this one API endpoint, pull it into a class, and we can use that class throughout our code. All right. So let's look at, go back over here to movie list SSR. Now here's where it gets kind of cool. All right. So once I call an API endpoint, all right, and I get a response from the movie API, it's going to put it into this object. And you can see here, it's of type popular movie response. Now, what you need to know here that's interesting is, notice that this doesn't have any connection at all to our UI. It's just calling out to an endpoint, a third-party endpoint, getting us a response and putting that response in a movie response object. Pretty simple, all right? And now in here, because of the way the Blazor is organized, it will detect that change and then build out this URL here, or build out all this content here. Now, in the case of SSR, specifically this render mode, and I'll notice here at the top here, I don't have a render mode specified. So if I don't specify it, it's going to default to SSR. That means that it will run this code here for each over this and build out this movie list for me. Okay. And it waits until this is complete in order to do that. And then when it's done, it basically then returns that to the page. Okay. But notice we didn't have to do anything else. So this is our onInitialize event. This is when the page comes up. This runs, it gets a response, and then the magic happens where it builds out the page here because this has a value now. Okay. Notice here we're checking to see if it's null, and if it's not null, it'll come down in this else and start building the page out for us. Now you hear these green lines here, these are components, and then this is a component for our model. So we're using two components here, and notice that we're for eaching over the response here, the object that we got, and then we're putting each card in a column. And this is a bootstrap row and a bootstrap column. And that's how we make our 4 columns across, okay? So if we go back and look at the code here, or the sample here, you can see this is the result we get. So when we refresh it, it calls out to that API endpoint, brings back the movies, displays them in the cards, okay? Now notice we didn't have to write any JavaScript or anything else to do this so far, so that's pretty powerful, all right? So let's continue to look at some more code here. So if I go back into Visual Studio, let's look at the component, because the component is kind of what's driving how these are displayed. And this is really why people are super excited about Blazor. It is a component first framework where everything is a component, and it allows us to do some really powerful features here. So notice here, this has a couple of properties in here. So let's look at our movie card, and this is our component here. And in our code here, we have parameters that are coming in, okay? And one of them is use JS for button, and one of them's popular movie, okay? Pretty simple, all right? And if the popular movie is not null, okay, that means that it has a movie in it, then take that object and start putting things in here. Now, the other thing is, if the component says use JS for the button, then it's going to render the button this way. And you can see here, it's using a JavaScript onClicked event, an attribute here, to call a JavaScript function to show the details. We'll go over that in a minute. Or if it doesn't have that, it's going to do it the C# way. And this will work for other render modes. So let's say that we're using something like SignalR or WebAssembly. Our buttons are going to look more like this, and we'll cover that in a later session. But if we're using server-side rendering, if we want interactive, in other words, we want this button to do something that's not a form post, respond to a click event, then we need to do JavaScript for that. And that is one of the distinctions between server-side render and the other modes, is that the other modes make the use of, you can use minimal JavaScript to do most of the things, whereas server-side render, you're still going to do JavaScript the old-fashioned way. All right. So this is just rendering out these components as it has results. All right. And so you can see here, I've got a component here, and it's just going to render. And because I said use JS button for true, go back here and look at the card here. It's going to render this as a JavaScript button. Kind of cool. All right. So finally, let's look at what happens when we render it out in streaming mode, because now you can see, okay, so it basically maps in on the server side, runs through this loop, builds out a bunch of cards in this loop. And then we also have this one component here called a movie modal that gets loaded. We'll look at that real briefly. And so in the movie modal here is just HTML. It's just HTML. It has no code behind. It doesn't do anything at all. But notice here we have IDs on all of these HTML elements, so that when we call our button, we can access all these elements by ID and insert values in there, just like we would with, we used vanilla JavaScript to do this. But if you have another type of framework, there's ways that are very similar to this, where you grab a hold of the element, set its values, those types of things. All right. So let's go back to movie SSR here. And let's look at how this is different from the two modes here. So if we go to stream render here, you can see here, we set an attribute to streaming render true, but everything else is exactly the same. The code doesn't change. We just changed the streaming render mode. And this is where the power of Blazor will start showing itself. All right, so let's look and see how that looks differently. So we notice here when I refresh this page, nothing really happens until it's finished running, and then the page refreshes and it shows us the 8 movies. Well, let's look what happens when I change over to the streaming mode. You can see now I have placeholder content, and then the movies come in. So if we look at the code for that, and we go to the streaming render code component here, you can see here it says, if movie response is null, meaning there's nothing in it, meaning that on this initialize, this is not completed yet. It may take a few seconds to run. You may have a long running database process. This API may be slow. And so this will take a minute or seconds to come back. So what do I want to show? Well, I just want to show movie cards, but I don't have any properties coming into it. I'm not giving it a movie in here. I'm just saying, show me 8 blank cards. And so we can look at the movie card here and we can say, if popular movie, this is the value, the parameter being passed in is not null, just show some placeholder HTML. And we're using placeholder styling straight from Bootstrap here, okay? And then when it does find some movies in here, then bind it with the real information about the movie and show the card correctly, all right? And so this if statement is checking to see if popular movie is not null. Now here's where it gets interesting, all right? So if we go back and look over here, I want you to think through this. And so if I refresh this, notice it builds 8 cards, and then suddenly the cards change. But if you look at the code, we really didn't do anything to make them change. We didn't bind them to the UI or anything like that. It just changed on its own. And this is the power of streaming. So what streaming is doing is it opened up the HTTP request. And the first time it opens up, it says, hey, I'm going to load the HTML that I have. And it comes to this component and it says popular movie is null. So it says, okay, well, I can load this placeholder content, and it goes through and loads 8 of those. All right. And if you go back and look over here, this is where this is being done here. I've got, I'm looking at for each response to the movies, but if they're null, if the movie response is null, just give me 8 blank cards. And I'm using the same component for this, but my properties that are being passed into it make it behave differently. And that is very, very powerful. So I can use the same UI for both of them, but because I'm passing in a movie, it'll behave different. Now, what we can do is, the magic is that this takes a few seconds to run. We delayed it by 3 seconds, and then we call our endpoint, and then that takes a second or two to come back from the movie API, and we get a response. Well, notice it loaded in movie card, the blank one's right here. And then as soon as it changed, as soon as this value changed, it re-executed this if statement and said, oh, it's no longer null. Now let me stream just the movie card results to my UI. All right, so let's go look at it one more time and show you how that works in real life. And so I'm on the stream endpoint here, this stream here, and I'm going to just refresh the page. And you can see here, it loaded 1, 2, 3, and then finally the movie response object changed, and then it rebound the UI. We didn't have to write JavaScript to do that. We didn't have to do anything to do that. All of that happened on the server, but the streaming mode allowed us to see parts of the page before the long running process was finished. If you go over to SSR, you can see it'll wait and then it'll load, and it loads all the page at once. Streaming allows us to show the end user something, some placeholder content, and then when that long running process completes, it shows us the real content. All right, so finally, let's look at how JavaScript works inside of Blazor. So when I click more info here, I have a modal that pops up, and it's bound to whatever's in the current movie I'm looking at. So here's the trench. If I click here, Heart and Stone, we get the information about that movie. Or if you're a Barbie fan, we get here information about Barbie. Now notice here, we're using the same modal HTML, just binding it with different values. And this is a very common technique that you're going to use with whatever framework you're going to have. You want to write a modal for each card here, because this list could be 100, and we don't want to have 100 modals with specific information in them. We want to dynamically set this modal, and this allows us to do it inside of Visual Studio. So let's look inside of Visual Studio here and see how that works. Now notice here, I've got, when we load in our stuff here, I just load in a copy of the modal, because the modal, when I want to pop it, needs to be on the page, and that's kind of how that works for Bootstrap. It hides the content, and then when you hit the button, it displays the modal. Our job is to put information inside of that modal. Okay. Now notice there's no code here to do that. All right. So what's doing it is the buttons inside of our movie card. So if I go over to movie card here, And I've got this parameters being passed in, use JS for a button. For streaming side rendering, SSR, we still have to use JavaScript for interactivity. Okay. If we're using SignalR or WebAssembly, then we get the more enhanced versions of this, and it behaves more like a SPY app that you see with Angular or React. Okay. So right now, what we're using is client-side JavaScript to fill this modal up. So we have an on-click event. All right. And so this on-a-click event runs show movie details, and then it passes a copy of the button in there so that we can get this popular movie ID that was set on the server. So we know what movie to put our information in, okay? And so to do that, we need to use JavaScript. Now, we can add JavaScript to this project just like anything else. So right here, I've got in my WW root, I have a JS here. And you can see here, this function here is in JavaScript, and it can find it because it's attached to the page. And if you look at this, we attach it here in AppRaiser here. This is our startup component here. And you can see here, we at the bottom here, we're referencing our custom JS right here, okay? Now, typically, in a lot of cases, if you're running WASM or SignalR, you don't have the need for this, but I want to show you that you can do it just like you would normally if you run something in an SSR mode, all right? So, but as you'll see as we go forward to this, to do this, we basically get the movie ID from the attribute on the button that was being passed in, and then we call our endpoint right here. So we're calling a get movie function here. That's another AC function here, and it calls a fetch to get our minimal API endpoint. All right, and so we've set these up as I said before in your program CS, we have a minimal endpoint for popular and one for pulling back a specific movie. Okay. And this returns JSON just like any other API that you would call, right? But we're calling it to our server, and then our server calls out to the movie API so that our API key can be protected. Our server makes the call to the movie API and not the client, okay? And that's real important that our credentials are on the server side, and it's a security set, and that's why we use the API endpoint to be in the middle of our request here. Okay, so let's go back over here, or let's go back into our JavaScript. So inside of our JavaScript here, you can see here, this is called an endpoint, and now I have a movie response back in JavaScript, and then I have a lot of vanilla JavaScript to set the values for the modal here. Now, I'm not going to go over this. If you don't know how to use JavaScript, that's fine. Just know that there's a lot of work here to set that. And what Blazor is giving the promise on as we review other modes here is that this type of code goes away when you use SignalR or when you use WebAssembly or the auto mode. Or if you just allow the server to do it, you don't have to do this. But in the case of modals and pop-ups and things like that, currently with SSR, we've got to use JavaScript to do that. And it's a lot of code here, but it does work. So let's look at it one more time here and see how it kind of works. And then if I click more info here, I get the trench. And if I come down here to across the Spider-Verse, I get a different movie. Okay, all done with JavaScript. Okay, so that's the first two modes that are by default out of the box with Blazor. It's called SSR. In future videos, we'll go over SignalR, how that code works, and also WASM and auto. Well, I'll see you in the next video. Good luck and keep coding.